In the last deep dive video, we talked about something that often surprises people. We talked about numbers, about children being exposed to language for thousands and thousands of hours, not because they are studying, but simply because they are immersed in it. If you roughly calculate the time a child is awake between the ages of 2 and 6, you easily arrive at something like 16,000 hours of exposure to their native language. That number is not a precise scientific measurement, it's just a rough approximation, and if anything, it's probably an underestimate, because language exposure doesn't start at the age of 2. Infants are surrounded by speech from the very beginning, and research suggests that even before birth, the brain already processes aspects of language, especially rhythm and prosody. Newborns can recognize the voice of their mother, and they already show sensitivity to the melody of the language they heard in the womb. So the real amount of exposure is almost certainly much, much higher. And I ended the last video by saying, of course, no adult has that kind of time. But the mechanism still works if we use it deliberately. Today, I want to unpack what that actually means. Because when people hear a number like 16,000 hours or even more, the first reaction is usually, well, then I don't stand a chance. That reaction is completely understandable, but it's also wrong. It's based on the wrong comparison. And here's why. Think about how a child learns what yesterday means. At first, it sounds like just another word. But yesterday isn't really about a word at all. It's about a concept. A child has to understand that time has a direction, that things happen in a sequence, that something can be finished and still matter. That takes years. Now think about you. You already know what yesterday means. You know what maybe means. You know what if means. You understand cause and effect, comparison, abstraction, possibility. You don't need to build any of them from scratch. You only need to map a new word, a new form, onto an idea, onto a concept you already have. That is an enormous shortcut, and it doesn't stop there. You already know how language works. Not in a theoretical sense, but a practical one. Language doesn't just carry information. It carries attitude, intention, social insights, a whole layer of meaning beneath the words. We all use those layers constantly. We're just not always aware of it. You have spent your entire life using language strategically. You know how to tell a story. You know how to be polite. You know how to hint at something without saying it directly. A 3-year-old does not know any of that. You can also read. You can write. That means you can see patterns on a page and you can take notes to support your memory. A child acquiring their first language does not have that tool. And perhaps most importantly, you have metacognition. That means you can think about your own thinking. You can notice something, step back and ask, wait, why does this work like that? You can compare. You can deduce. You can decide to focus. So, when people say adults learn worse than children or slower than children, I would rephrase that. Adults learn differently. And if we learn differently, the learning environment has to reflect that difference. Let me show you what I mean. A child can afford to hear the same pattern 10,000 times. Eventually, statistical learning does the rest. The brain registers frequency and stability emerges. We talked about that. adult cannot afford that. An adult just does not have the time. But an adult can do something a child cannot. An adult can see the pattern. Imagine I show you 5 German sentences. Er spielt, sie tanzt, es regnet, er lacht, sie singt. Even if you don't speak German, you already see something, don't you? Every single verb ends in T. A child would need far more repetitions before the pattern stabilizes implicitly. Hundreds of examples. You saw it in 5. In case you already know some German, this example might not convince you. So let's look at another one. And this time, I'll use a language you probably don't speak. That way you can experience exactly what pattern detection feels like in real time. So let me give you the 5 Turkish words for you will love, you will learn, you will try, you will improve, and you will know. They are güleceksin, öğreneceksin, deneyeceksin, gelişeceksin, and bileceksin. Now, what do you notice? First, how many words are there in English and how many in Turkish to express the same idea? And second, what do you think the ending eceksin means? Exactly. Now, if you want to go one level deeper, the suffix ecek marks the future and sin marks second person singular. But here's the thing. You don't need to know that. Simply knowing that eceksin means you will, that's completely enough to work with the structure. The breakdown is just there to show you what's happening under the hood. It's not something you need to memorize or to reproduce. And by the way, if you happen to hear Jackson every time you hear eceksin, you're not alone. A couple of years ago, someone even made a song about that in a misheard lyrics series. Let's listen to it for a second.
Son bir kez yanıma gel. Nasıl gideceksin? İnsafa gel. Gözümde yaşlar.
Now, the fact that you deduced a structure doesn't mean you've mastered it. It doesn't mean you can produce it freely. But you've created a foothold, a conscious scaffold that reduces the amount of input you need to reach implicit stability. And that's the key idea. Adults don't replace the mechanism of language acquisition, they accelerate it by using what they already have. Not by skipping steps, but by using their cognitive advantages to move through those steps more efficiently. And this insight has a practical consequence. Again, if adults learn differently, the learning environment has to reflect that difference. And that's why my format follows a specific structure. Every unit has 3 parts. Part 1 is perception. This is where we train the ear. Sound distinctions, rhythm, and intonation. Because even with all the cognitive advantages in the world, if you don't perceive this contrast, you cannot produce it. We covered this in the last video. Now, you might think this sounds too basic. You might want to skip ahead and get to the real stuff. Don't. Trust me on this. Perception is what everything else is built on. And getting it right early actually saves you a lot of time later. Part 2 is structure. This is where adult cognition really shines. I show you patterns explicitly, and I give you patterns to discover on your own, not as rules to memorize, but as regularities to recognize. When you see that several verbs share a certain ending, or that a vowel change signals a structural shift, you are not memorizing a table, you are building a scaffold. And once you have that scaffold, every new example reinforces it. Every sentence you hear becomes evidence for a pattern you already suspect. That's what I mean by using the mechanism more deliberately. The input still does the heavy lifting, but structure tells the brain where to look. And part 3 is meaning. A meaning becomes much easier to decode when the first 2 layers are already in place. If you already know you are looking at a verb, you search for an action. If you recognize a prefix, you anticipate a shift in meaning. If you see a familiar pattern, you can narrow down possibilities. Without structure, a new sentence is complete chaos. With structure, it becomes a puzzle, and you already have some of the pieces. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. A while ago, I was working with a group of intermediate German learners here in Austria. We were looking at a text. An authentic text, of course, not simplified. And I had selected it specifically because it contained a cluster of words ending in ung. Wohnung, Anmeldung, Rechnung, Prüfung. I didn't say anything. I simply asked them to look at the 4 words and tell me what they noticed. Took about 10 seconds. They're all ending ung. They're all D. Wait, is that always the case? And I said, always. No exceptions. Of course, there's always someone. So Sergei, a very clever young man, looked at me and said, but what about schwung and sprung? Those end in ung too, and they are there, not D. Good catch. And I genuinely mean that. I love it when learners challenge a pattern. That's not disruption, that's real engagement. But it wasn't an exception, and I showed the group why. The point is, nobody in that room discovered anything by accident. The input was chosen so that the pattern would become visible. That's what I mean by structured input. And that shift from this is random and overwhelming to this belongs somewhere, I can work with this. In my experience, that is one of the most powerful moments in language learning. When something that seems opaque suddenly becomes transparent. So, no, adults do not need 16,000 hours. But they do need a system that takes their advantages seriously. Input, yes, but not watered down, simplified input. You can handle authentic input, paired with deliberate structure. This sequence, perception, structure, meaning, is not designed to keep you away from meaning or to delay the process. It's not there because it sounds elegant. It's there because it reflects how adult cognition actually processes language. Perception first, structure second, meaning third. A child walks into the ocean and can spend years getting used to the water. An adult needs a clear path to the deep end. In the next video, we'll get concrete. We'll look at what implicit grammar actually looks like in practice. And I'll walk you through a more extended step-by-step example.